Och, kaiju hopsaltes, kaiju grammaticos, TAC.
Anyhow, my name is Keith Toda. I am going to be presenting on practicing comprehensible input. This is part 2 of what Bob presented. So Bob presented theory the first session, and today, this session, I will be talking about some theory, but also talking about putting it into, how to put it into action. Someone asked me, this person right here, what's your name, Perry? All right, asked me specifically about how long have I been using comprehensible input. Full out, I've been using it for about 3 years now, but I had also some prior experience using TPRS, which we'll talk about. So if we're doing it for how long have I been doing it? About 8 years, but slowly, and then past 3 years, I've been implementing it. So let's talk about it. So in terms of Krashen's theory, and this is based on Stephen Krashen, and Bob went over his 5 hypotheses, but here's a good way to kind of summarize what comprehensible input is. It's this idea we acquire language when we understand messages, when we understand what people tell us, and when we understand what we read. So in terms of even as Latin, we want to be able to communicate. We want our students to understand messages, what we are saying, because sometimes, you know, maybe in some of your sessions, in your reading sessions, maybe it was done in Latin and it was not understandable to you, and part of Krashen's theory is the minute you start not to understand something, or you start to, your affective filter starts to rise. You start to be like, oh my gosh, I don't understand. Everyone understands, and then soon it gets it here, and learning stops. So in terms of reading, the reason why I wanted to kind of focus on reading, because I kind of feel like when it comes to the idea of speaking Latin, or just active Latin, everyone has their different ideas. Some people say, oh, we need to keep it as a true communicative language. We need to keep it that way. And then some people are like, well, I want students to read, so it still should be about the AP Latin literature, the syllabus. But I focused on this because I felt like reading is what every one of us if we're teachers, want our students to do. We all want them to read. So this is why I picked this particular quote. Our reading ability, our ability to write an acceptable writing style, our spelling ability, vocabulary knowledge, and our ability to handle complex syntax is the result of reading. So even in reading, we want to deliver comprehensible messages. We want to give them input with this. So one of the things I get asked a lot is like, do you do immersion in your Latin class? And let me just say this. Some of you, I was telling this earlier, for years, I was the biggest advocate against any type of spoken Latin. I mean, anytime someone say, oh, you should be speaking Latin, I'm like, why? Who speaks it? I mean, I was that person who'd be like, well, we're going to read the works of Cicero. We don't need to know the word for like blender. We don't need to know the word for computer, because it's all about the classics. And then long story short, eventually I attended Rusticatio in 2010 and realized, oh my gosh, we can actually communicate in Latin. Granted, I was not a great speaker. I still am not a great speaker. I don't consider myself to be probably a good intermediate speaker. But at the same time, yes, I do use immersion in my class. But I think we got to be careful with that term when we talk about immersion and this idea of comprehensible input. And the main reason is anytime we do immersion, is what I'm saying understandable, comprehensible? It needs to be understandable to the listeners. So in terms of if I teach a Latin 1 class, yes, I will speak in Latin to them, but it's going to be at a level that they understand. This theory is called input plus 1. What is it that they understand? And that plus 1 is, okay, I just want to push them a little bit. Secondly, is what I'm saying even compelling? Because I can speak in Latin and it's totally understandable. You're like, I don't care that you have a cat. But it's got to be something interesting. In fact, I want to say it was last week. I don't know if you know who Bill Van Patten is, but he's a second language acquisition professor at, I think, Michigan State. And he actually has a radio show called Tea with BVP. And it's actually pretty good. But one of the things he was saying was, if you want to get students to communicate in your class, you got to make it interesting to them. It's got to be something that they will want to take part in. It's something we call PQAS, personalized questions and answers. This is one way you can deliver input, and what happens is, because it's interesting to them, they don't even realize that you're talking about, that we're focusing on a particular part of the language. The example he used was, I'm just going to pick on someone, so I apologize if you don't want this. I'm going to pick Amanda since she's now a new follower. Amanda, what do you have in your refrigerator?
Wine.
That's it? Okay. But that's interesting. Amanda has wine in her refrigerator. May I ask, Penny?
Yes.
Penny, what do you have in your what do you have in your refrigerator?
Tomatoes.
That's it? You have wine and you have tomatoes, and what else do you have in your refrigerator? Broccoli? Pasta. All right. So Amanda has wine. Penny has broccoli and pasta. What do you think Justin Bieber has in his refrigerator? Someone tell me, what do you think Justin Bieber has in his refrigerator? Do you think Justin Bieber has tomatoes? Do you think he has broccoli? Do you think he has wine?
Yes.
Yeah. What else do you think he may have in his refrigerator? Champagne. Yeah. What was that? Oh, okay. Bacon. Okay. But what we just suddenly did, we made it interesting. We went from, because what we were just doing is making a list of, I've got this in my refrigerator. You made it interesting, thank you very much, about the wine. But you're like, I have milk, I have eggs, I have bread. And the minute you go to Justin Bieber, it's like, oh, what do you think he's got? And I immediately, when I said that, I saw all your eyes just go like that. Like suddenly it was like, I don't care that she has broccoli. But the minute I said Justin Bieber, you guys were interested. And all we just did was make a list. But suddenly the list was interesting. It's compelling. This is where we need to be careful. Immersion can turn into submersion for students. Because what happens is, if it's not understandable to them, then simply it's just noise. That's the way I call it. I've been in many immersion environments, and the idea is you want to, and I can understand to a degree what's being spoken in Latin, I just can't produce it. But there are times where I just don't know what you're saying. And like I said, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm getting frustrated, and that's what we don't want to do with our students. So if you're going to do immersion, and I'm not saying go for it right away, because sometimes you can, you jump into it, too quickly, and then you yourself get submerged. If you're going to do it, just make it understandable to them. And we'll talk about there are different ways you can make it understandable. So I'm not saying immersion's wrong. I'm just saying if you're going to do it in a comprehensible input way, you got to be careful the way you do it. So when I talk about comprehensible input based on what Bob was saying, there are different components of what I would say are important to be in an activity or a comprehensible input. And because that's one of the things people always ask me is like, what is a way I can teach the dative? And I'm like, well, let's not focus on the dative. Let's focus on just getting language in there. But I say, when you do a CI activity, it's what I call deep and narrow. You are going to focus on certain things. One of my favorite quotes, educational quotes, it's by Mr. Rogers. He says, I find that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. And anyone who's taught the AP syllabus, shallow and complex is the AP syllabus. And I apologize if you love the AP syllabus, but I feel like we're running through it. So the problem is, it's just we never, and just think of any subject area, we like run through it and we cover on a very shallow level. And sometimes when we cover grammar, we cover on a very shallow level because we're like, oh, because the idea is we think, oh, we introduced the imperfect tense on Monday, because the chapter goes through next Wednesday, they're going to master it by that Wednesday. No, all we did was introduced it. Probably they're not going to master it until as you keep reviewing it over and over again, maybe 3 weeks later that they finally get it. But we want to keep it narrow, but go deep with it. It's this idea, well, we'll get to it. Established meaning in Latin, in L1, which means, and this is where some people have some major problems with comprehensible input, this idea of we are going to use English just to establish meaning. So if this were, let's say I was going to do a lesson, let's say I wanted to introduce the word, introt, I would actually have this on the board. And anytime I use that word, I would point to it. It's called point and pause, where I point to it, I pause. And what happens is at least a kid, by hopefully the 10th time, they don't need to keep looking at it. But that one student who doesn't needs it, because it's that missing link. They don't understand what you mean by it. And some people say, no, that means you're forcing them to work in English. I'm like, yes, but this is not the end goal. We are going to keep working with this word over and over again. Output. One thing about comprehensible input is we don't force output per se. We don't do like the audiolingual method where it's just like, now read this dialogue, and the dialogue makes no sense to them. The idea with output is, yeah, we want students to output, but when they feel ready, and it's going to be scaffolded, and it's going to be preceded by tons of input. That's what the whole comprehensible input theory is. Let's flood them with understandable messages that eventually the output is just the natural overflow. Like they can't do anything but output what you've put into them. Every kid will be different with that, though, and that's hard when we're like, but we finished this chapter here, and how come you're not getting the accusative case still? Some do, and some don't, and I'm like, all right, we will just keep working with it over and over. Shelter vocabulary, not grammar. And this is one that people don't quite understand what we mean by that. We limit vocabulary. We stick to certain words. I don't know if you're like, I use Cambridge, and there are words, and I'm like, why do they have the word for wax tablet? And even if it were, for a story, it's like it appears twice. Latin for Americans, sportula. If anybody teaches that, they always teach the word sportula, and I'm like, of course that's the word the kids all grasp on, like, oh, it's a small gift basket. But I'm like, yeah, but that's not a word I want them to know. I'd probably want them to know like Walt, Hobbit, Dot, those kinds of words, but they're like sportula. My students latch onto the word. Explode it. They love to have them write something. Everything explodes. Pulsat. Everyone punches everybody. So I'm like, good, as long as you get that direct object in there. But the idea is the reason why we want to shelter grammar, or shelter vocabulary first is focus on keywords, and then we can just blow up grammar and go all the way with the grammar with it. Because sometimes when we do it the other way around, it's like we limit the grammar, but we make all these words that suddenly it becomes, I don't know any of these words. But we want to focus on, I know this word, and sometimes they will figure things out on their own when we talk about shelter and grammar. Like, there is no reason why we can't teach, let's say, subjunctive clauses in Latin 1. The only reason, and because we always do that, we're like, oh, now we're like, indirect statements, when I would teach that under the grammar approach, made my stomach hurt. I would always be like, oh, sequences, oh, this is so horrible, I hate it. But if you do it in a natural way and just do it with a very limited vocabulary, even subjunctives, they don't blink. They're just like, I'm like, in order to. And they're like, okay. That's really easy. And what's happening is they don't have to focus on the vocabulary word because they already know the word. What happens is sometimes if they don't know the word or the form, then two things are going on at the same time, and it's really hard for them. And the final thing about comprehensible input, we are being very deliberate. We're not just randomly throwing things out there. Sometimes it looks like we are. But I have everything scaffolded, sequenced in a particular way. It was like, I'm trying to get you to learn this particular thing, but I'm going to do all these other things that's not going to make it look like we're focusing on the dative. Let me show you some examples of this, because like I said, I know I gave you some components, but examples of comprehensible input, there are lots of them. There's something called TPR, total physical response, and that's where I associate movement with either words. It's like, or it could be like Simon Says. That's always a fun way to do it. But sometimes even with gestures, like one of the gestures I teach very early, like even day one, it's like, this is est. Anytime I use the word est, it's this. And this is ne, question mark. So I always go est ne. So in other words, and I make them do it with me. I was like, anytime I do est, I'm like, just do it. est, ne. And the funny thing is now, and this has been like 4 or 5 months since Latin 1 started, is that now when they have a question, like, Mr. Toda, I have a question. Because ne is really hard for them to get, because they see something like tu ne. They're like, what's tune? I'm like, no, it's tu ne. They're like, oh, okay, I get it. Or eratne, it just looks like so weird. I'm like, oh, erat to me is this. So it's est in the past, but eratne. So in other words, we associate like muscle memory. You can, like I said, you can also do it with, and James Asher is the one who developed this back in the 70s. The problem with TPR, it gets old really fast. Because if you're playing Simon Says, there's only so many times they can open the door, go through it, and close the door, and all that kind of stuff. But it's a different way to also teach vocabulary. TPRS, which is not the plural of TPR, but it came from TPR. It means teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. And this is Blaine Ray's, some of you may be familiar with it. This is a way where it started out is just simply telling a story in the target language, but then the students would then come up with ideas. So they're creating the story. So in other words, there's buy-in. But a lot of times you are controlling the story, so it's not this random story. So if I had the word, let's say the word was introt that I was trying to tell, I would say, tell a little story. I'd say, oh, discipuli. And I'm going to use your name. What's your name? Tara. Tara est in cubiculo. And then you would all respond, oh, so do that. So try oh. Oh. No, let's say oh. Oh, like you really mean it. Oh. So I would say Tara est in cubiculo. Oh. And then I'd ask some questions, but then I'd say, said aliquis, someone, aliquis introt. Oh. And then I would say, oh, so discipuli. Quis, who? Quis introt. And then you would start giving me answers. So, discipuli, quis introt. Someone just yell something out. Quis. Justin Bieber. So, fortasse, and this is the sign for maybe. Fortasse, Justin Bieber introt. Quis alius. Who else? Justin Bieber? Selena Gomez. Whoa. So fortasse, Selena Gomez. Anyone else? A refrigerator. Oh, so fortasse, Justin Bieber introt. Fortasse, Selena Gomez introt. Fortasse, frigidarium introt. Well, Justin Bieber known introt. Selena Gomez known introt at Praesertum, frigidarium known introt. Betty White introt. So in other words, I was hoping, because my students always love saying Betty White. Anytime someone happens, I'm like, so, who enters? Betty White! And I'm like, and they love it. But sometimes I can be like, okay, I got sort of a good response with Justin Bieber, kind of a response here. I'm like, I'm looking for one where the kids are just like, oh, yes, like Deadpool apparently opened yesterday. So I start eliciting answers from you guys, and then I run with it. But I'm actually controlling the story. And who cares about Justin Bieber? I was trying to get you to learn the word introt. And I would say, okay, my goal is to use it as many times as I can. So TPRS is a form of CI, but CI, comprehensible input, is not TPRS. I know that sounds like a rhombus is not a square, but a square is not a rhombus, and you're like thinking that through. Because TPRS is a form of comprehensible input. It used to be that was the only form of comprehensible input. That's what you only could do. But there are so many different ways you can use comprehensible input. And this is the one of the things which I want to emphasize to you, is that you can do so many different things. You don't have to jump into it right away if you don't feel comfortable asking a story, even if you're not even familiar with even saying Latin out of your mouth. There are so many different ways, and now we call it TCI, Teaching with Comprehensible Input. Look at the time. TPR, Circling with Balls, TPRS, Personalized Question and Answer, Dictation, which is simply me reading some sentences in Latin and you write it down. That sounds so boring to me. But I remember when I first tried it, I'm like, oh, this is going to fail. I couldn't get enough of it. As a teacher, I was like, oh, all I have to do is read sentences. The kids have to do all the work, but they actually, they hate it. And then they're like, and then I'll talk about it, and they're like, I'm like, how did you know that word? And they won't tell me the dictation. But they'll just say, I just knew it. I'm like, okay, I know why you knew it. Time rights, movie talks, ping pong reading, a lot of these things I'm not going to talk about. Read and discuss, one-word picture, reader's theater. This is simply just acting it out. Embedded readings, which I'm going to show. Word association, choral reading. There's a lot, and unfortunately I wish I had more time to talk about these, but there's so many different ways that you can introduce comprehensible input but not feel like you have to do TPRS, because like I said, that's hard. In fact, when I first did TPRS, I learned it in 2007. I was all excited about it. I'm like, yes, we're going to get rid of the textbook. I'm going to do this. I lasted 6 weeks because I had no, it was great. The kids loved it, but I had no idea where I was going. And then the kids started asking, when are you going to tell those stories again? And I'm like, I don't want to do it. The following year, I did it 9 weeks. I'm like, and then the following year, I did it for a semester. I was able to last. And that's the idea with this. When you do comprehensible input, first off, it's hard. And I don't want to come across as saying, on Monday, you better, or Tuesday, if you go back to school on Tuesday, you better do it this way, because if you don't, you're wrong. I don't want you to walk away feeling like I'm a bad teacher because I don't do this. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is see if you can introduce some things. I have a blog, and apparently I write stuff that people like. And I'm always impressed, and I'm not putting on false humility when I say this. I read what I write, and sometimes I'm like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. I do, and I always say little elves must come in and change it, what I write, and make it sound good, because I don't think I really know comprehensible input that well. Sorry, Jason, I don't mean it like, oh my gosh. No, but it is one of those things where it just becomes so part of you that it's just, after a while, you just know what to do. But let me also say this, I didn't just come out of a box like this. And there are days I fail. There are days where things just don't go. The kids will say to me, yeah, today just wasn't one of your better days. Well, at least they verify it, so. Yeah, because there are days that are going to be like, you're on and they're off. And there are days where you're off and they're on, and then there's days where you're both off, and that's a win-win day. And then there are days, and you know those days where you're both on, and you just walk away in a teaching high, and you're just like, oh my gosh, that just worked. So let me give you an example of embedded reading, because this is one way you can easily introduce CI. It takes some effort on your part, because simply the idea of embedded reading is to take a reading and make it simple, and then keep expanding it, keep adding more things to it, and they're constantly rereading it, which is going to reinforce grammar, reinforce structures. So here's one. Carol wanted to go to a concert. Her mom said no. Carol decided to sneak out. The structure I'm focusing on is wanted plus the infinitive and decide plus the infinitive. So that's an example of version 1, but that's not my original thing. Here's the second version. Justin Bieber was in concert, and Carol wanted to go. Carol asked her mom, but her mom said no. Carol decided to sneak out, so she crawled out the window. What new pieces of information did I add? Because that's the point, is that you add new pieces each time, because that's what's going to make it compelling for the kid to read. What new pieces of information did I add from the first one? Justin Bieber, we know who's in concert. Yeah, we added some conjunctions, made the sentence a little more complex. What are some new pieces of information we also added? We found out how she snuck out, but we still have Carol wanted to go. Carol asked her mom, but her mom said no. Carol decided to sneak out. Now, I would never make this dramatic of a leap, but I did it just to prove a point. Hearing that Justin Bieber was in concert, Carol wanted to go. When her mom said no, Carol decided to sneak out by crawling out the window. On the way to the concert, Carol was attacked by zombies. Carol wanted to go home. I always like to put a moral in mine. And let's say this was the final version I wanted them to read. I would never make that big of a jump from second to third version, but notice I was able to make this, complex grammar to a degree, but we've already established the meaning that we knew that Justin Bieber was in concert. I I used a when clause. I used it was this a part of gerund statement here, and then this new part. But notice I still got the wanted to go, decided to sneak out, wanted to go. I also got a passive in here. So this is an example in English of an embedded reading. I'm going to show you an example of one in Latin. But the idea with embedded readings, all I want them to do is simply read it over again. And the thing is that you have to Lori Clark, she's the one who developed this. She says you have to make sure you always change the opening sentence, because the kids will say, we read this already. And yeah, the thing also, it's got to be compelling each time. Every new piece of information you add needs to be compelling, because I did one time, and I thought it was good. And I said, now we're going to version 2. And the kids said, it really wasn't that interesting the first time. And I went, sorry. And then they read it again. They're like, please tell me there's no third version of this, because it's not interesting. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, what is the time frame between 1 and 3? 1, 2.
Oh, it could actually be a day, or even in 2 days. It could be that they're already ready for this. Because here's the same thing too. Sometimes you give them a reading and they see the length. They're like, oh, this is too long. Boom, I'm not going to read it. And then I don't want to say you trick them into it, but the idea is, look, you started here and now we're ready for more. And the idea, because it's more interesting, they want to read it. Here's an example, and this is from the Pericles group, which is Kevin Balestrini. Here's an example of something from the AP syllabus. And this is on the Pericles group website. There are different tiers. So this is from Laocoon. Whereas magna multitudo aderant. Laocoon clamavat, o QAS mystery, est insania, vos creditus hostes abesse, none donum Graecum malum est, num Graeci dona bona dant. That's version 1. Version 2, now we get the word katerwa. We've already established that it meant multitude. Laocoon kukuret, was it kukuret? Et clamavat, o QAS mystery, est insania, vos creditus hostes ovectos, creditus donum Graecum sine dolo esse, num Graeci dona sine dolo dant. What's happening is now we're trying to get the vocabulary in there that the actual text uses. It gets, oh, now we get this new piece of information. Until finally, it's that. If you gave students that to read right away, they would panic, because they would just say, I can't do this. So all we did with the embedded reading was simply, let's just make it easy for them. Have them read it again. We added more pieces. We start to change some of the things into like ablative absolutes. We start to change the word order, and finally we give them the final. And it's not that hard now. They still may have to rearrange and stuff, but they're like, they should be familiar with the vocabulary by this point. So that's an example of an embedded reading, and that's comprehensible input, because they're getting repetitions of these particular things. So our goal in all of this, it should be, we want to shave seconds anywhere we can and get learners to a particular proficiency. So CI, the reason why I like about it is because I'm delivering understandable messages to them in Latin. Oh, sorry. Since my goal is to get them to a particular level, I'm surprised again, like students latch on to certain words like malus puer. I know they love saying that. We did a back chat of, have you guys seen Roman Mysteries? I don't know, if you know, they're really cheesy. So I had the kids do a back chat about certain things in Flavia, and the funny thing is they didn't Latin. They're like pulchra puella. And then lupus, malus puer, and I was surprised, and they just somehow picked up those phrases because we had used them over and over again. And then some people didn't like Flavia, so like mala puella. But I was like, oh my gosh, somehow they know this. And the whole thing is output needs to be the natural overflow of input. Tomorrow, well, here's some resources. Tomorrow, both Bob and I will be giving demos of what these things look like, and how you can do it in your classroom. Because that's the one thing we want you to be able to walk away with. Is like, okay, how can I do some of this? Because some of this is hard, and then some of it just takes time. So again, I don't want you to feel like, going back to your classroom and trying something and you don't feel like you have enough foundation yet, and that's okay. But the idea is, how can I deliver some comprehensible messages to students where we're using the language to actually teach the structures? Because I think a lot of times, especially grammar translation, we teach the grammar to teach the language. But how can we use the language to teach the structure? All right, I'm pretty much out of time. And Jason, what's next for them?
Well, next is just coffee hour. So what we can do is we can thank Keith. This was fabulous. Thank you very much.